Welcome back to Department 1, People versus Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present with Mr. Chesnoff and Mr. DeGuerin, and we have Mr. Lewin, Milius, Henderson.
We don't have comments.
And no, we do have our court reporter. There you are. Okay. Gotta raise my seat up so I have a better view of all. All right, all jurors are present. Parties are present. Counsel's present. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, our witness, has resumed the witness stand. I'll remind you that you're under oath. Mr. Lewin is cross-examining Dr. Loftus. You may continue your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Loftus, two quick questions that relate to yesterday's testimony. One of them I asked you about a few minutes ago before we came into court, or before, excuse me, the jury came in. You had testified yesterday in terms of your involvement with the Bundy case, and that you became involved in Utah. He had not been charged in any of the Washington crimes yet. He was a student at the University of Washington where you were a teacher at the time that some of his crimes took place. Is that right?
Ted Bundy was an undergraduate
Yes.
at the University of Washington. I don't remember if we overlapped.
No. Oh, okay. No, I'm not asking if you knew him. I'm just saying you were up there and in Washington at the time when many of these crimes took place. Is that correct?
At the time that some of the crimes took place, yes.
Right. And the question I'd asked you yesterday was, you agree that once Ted Bundy ended up being arrested in Utah, before you took the case, even though he had not been charged in any crime in Washington, you were aware that he was a suspect in a series of murders up in the Washington area. Is that correct?
I had only heard a whiff of a suspicion that he might be the Ted that was connected to Washington.
Right. So in other words, I'm just trying to clarify. It's not that you had a bunch of evidence, but in other words, it's not as if you end up taking this case in Utah and then you later find out, oh my God, this guy is a suspect in these other cases. You didn't have direct evidence, but you had heard that he was potentially a person of interest in those cases, correct?
It was, I'd only heard a rumor because I was not living in Seattle at that time. During that time, I was at Harvard on a fellowship that I was awarded to work with the president and dean of arts and sciences at Harvard. So I was not privy to the media in Seattle.
Right. Doctor, I've got to ask you, in the question that I just asked you a moment ago, can you tell me in your answer how the fact that you were at Harvard working for the president and the dean, can you tell me how that answer was responsive to anything that I said?
Because when you spoke to me before we resumed testimony, you insinuated that I would have access to lots of media that was occurring in Seattle where I wasn't living at the time.
No, doctor, so my question though is that all you had to say was, I was not living in Seattle. Why did you add the comments about who you were working for, how prestigious it was? Was that an attempt, doctor, to, again, kind of tell the jury who you are, how important, how successful, et cetera? How is that responsive to what I asked you?
Well, I was away for the year at Harvard. You can ignore the rest of what I was doing there.
Well, no, I'm just asking, did you realize when you answered that question that it was not responsive to what I asked? There's no grounds that he said on his objection.
I'll sustain it.
Your Honor, could counsel please give a grounds? He's just saying objection with no grounds.
Sorry. I heard it. It was assumed a fact, not an evidence, but that was not responsive.
Doctor, the other issue that I wanted to clarify was I want to make sure that I understood this. Were you saying that as a faculty member at UCI, as a tenured professor, that you are allowed 1 day a week, which would be, I guess, 20% of your work time, to do whatever you want for whatever fees you want, independent of the university, that's what tenured professors are allowed to do?
It may be written 13 days a quarter, but it works out to 1 day a week.
Okay. All right. Let's talk for a moment about details versus gist. You would agree that there's a difference between remembering an event itself and remembering more peripheral details of an event. Is that correct?
Yes.
And would you agree that there's a difference between implanting false memories about details of an event versus implanting memories about the gist of the event itself?
It's probably easier to plant false memories of peripheral details than, say, central details.
Doctor, let me ask you, you just used the qualifier probably. Is it probably easier, or do your studies demonstrate that it is easier?
Generally, I think it would be easier to plant peripheral details.
So, doctor, was it an accident that you used a qualifier probably to minimize the meaning of the question I asked you?
Absolutely not.
Have you noticed, doctor, that in the testimony you've given, whenever I ask you a question that in any way implies or leads to the idea that is a point that is positive for the prosecution in this case, that the way you respond is, it might be, possibly, probably. Do you notice that you use a lot of those qualifiers or no?
Well, I noticed that you're accusing me of it, yes.
Do you think that's an unfair accusation?
No, because I try to be careful and not overstate things.
Well, let me ask you something. If your studies, I believe in the ripple effects in memory, that is an article or a book you wrote, correct?
I believe that I used the term ripple effects in possibly an article from 15 years ago, perhaps.
And do you recall in the work that you've done, doctor, that you have literally found in your work that it is much easier to implant memories about peripheral details than about the gist?
That's what I said, yes.
No, doctor, you said probably. You did not say that, in fact, my studies have indicated that, Mr. Lewin, you are correct.
Objection argumentative, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Doctor, do the studies that you've done, when you did them, do they indicate that it is probably more difficult to implant false memories relating to the gist rather than peripheral details, or do they demonstrate, based on your studies and your knowledge, that it is more difficult?
Some studies have shown that some studies have demonstrated that it is easier to plant peripheral details.
And if I were to give you a chance to rephrase your original answer, would it be fair that you would probably drop the word probably?
No, not necessarily.
What does not necessarily mean?
I don't know how many ways to say this. There are studies that show that it is easier to plant false memories of peripheral details than central details. I would agree with that statement.
You're familiar with the study that asked college students, this was an issue about individuals walking out of a restaurant without paying. You're aware of those studies, correct?
Yes, that was the study that I think from 15 years ago.
Right, a study you were involved with yourself.
I was one of the co-authors, yes.
So specifically, those individuals were asked 3 open-ended questions. They were asked, the individuals in the study, to recall the price of the total bill, the drink the person who had walked out and ordered before being seated, the dessert the person had, and the 3 items were intended to kind of constitute a general memory of the single event, meaning those were peripheral events, and the gist being that the person had walked out without paying. Is that correct? Is that a fair?
You'd have to show me the study. It's been too long since I've reviewed that work.
Well, no, I'm simply asking you if that was the general outline of what you were doing in your study. You were trying to basically take individuals, you wanted to show them a person who is walking out without paying, and then you wanted to ask them specific questions about more peripheral details, correct?
Well, my recollection of that study is different, that we were interested in whether if the person walked out had a bad intention versus a good intention, would it affect the way people remembered what happened?
Well, let me ask you, let's assume, doctor, based on your 50 years in the area, would you expect that if you had a situation where an individual is in a restaurant and they're seated across the table, someone at a table next to them, and they're observing this person, and at the end, they see this person all of a sudden get up and run out of the restaurant without paying? Would you expect that the individuals observing that would have a better memory of the fact that they ran out of the restaurant without paying, or would you expect that they would have an equal or better memory about, for instance, what dessert the person was eating?
I believe they'd have a better memory of somebody walking out, but that's my opinion.
Right, and your opinion is based on 50 years of science that tells you that the gist, the main detail of that observation is the person walking out, and the peripheral details are the other issues that I brought up. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. I want to ask you, did the studies that you've worked at demonstrate, strike that, would you expect that, for instance, if an individual had a conversation, they're having a conversation with a close friend of theirs, and that close friend tells them about something terrible they had done, would you expect the listener to remember the general information that my friend told me I did X, Y, Z, versus peripheral details, for instance, such as where they were when it happened, what day of the week it was on, what they were wearing? You'd expect them to remember the gist, the main issue would be, my friend told me they did something terrible, correct?
Yes.
And the studies support that, is that correct?
Yes.
And would you agree that even after time passes from an event, although peripheral details tend to be lost, so as an example, let's go back to the example I just gave you. A close friend tells a witness, I've done this terrible thing. Are you following my hypothetical so far?
Yes.
The individual, the witness, is talked to an hour later, and they're asked the following questions. Hey, what did the person tell you? And where were you when they told you? And what was the person wearing today that told you? Fair to expect that because it's so close in time, you might expect the witness to remember those peripheral details about the day of the week, where they were, what the other person was wearing, because it's so close in time, right?
Yes.
You also wouldn't be surprised, because the gist was that terrible statement of, oh my God, my friend is admitted to doing something terrible, that they might completely forget the peripheral details because they just weren't very important. Agreed?
Yes.
And you would expect that if I asked that person the same thing 10 years later, they're going to remember the fact, the gist, that my friend told me they did a terrible thing, much more likely than they're going to remember the peripheral details, correct?
I'd agree with that, yes.
All right, let's talk about the next area. I want to ask you, in terms of the causes of the implantation of false memory, would you agree that it is harder for a false memory of a statement to be implanted if the listener did not want to believe the false statement when they were told the information?
Yes.
So, as an example, if somebody tells you, the same example, someone tells a close friend, I've done a horrible thing, I helped cover up a murder, you would agree that an individual hearing that from a close friend, that is very likely to be disturbing, right?
It could be. It might be.
Okay, so there's a couple of qualifiers. Let me just understand that. So a close friend tells you, I have helped somebody cover up a murder. And your response to that is, well, it could be upsetting to the listener hearing that. It might be upsetting the listener hearing that. How on earth could it be anything other than extremely upsetting if a close friend is now basically saying they helped cover up a murder?
If somebody believed the speaker had a tendency to exaggerate or even be dramatic, and it might not be upsetting.
So what you're telling me
It
is...
might just be a story.
Right. So what you're telling me is that if the person did not believe what they were told at the time, then they might have less of a memory of the event. Is that correct?
Well, then they might not find it particularly upsetting.
Right, but let's go the other way. Let's say that individuals all said, you know what, when I heard this, it was extremely upsetting to me. Would you expect that that would be remembered over time?
I would expect it if they truly had the feeling at the time, yes. But if they are reporting that they were upset, you would want to know a little bit more. Did they have that feeling at the time?
Right, and you would believe, doctor, that just knowing human nature in your 50 years as a psychologist, that if a close friend of yours says, I've helped cover up a murder, that the only reasonable possibility as to why the listener would not be upset would be if they didn't believe what they were being told. Fair?
Well, that's one reason I can think of, on the spot like this.
Give me another reason you can think of on the
Well,
spot.
I'd have to think about it a little more.
Go ahead. I'll wait.
If it were my friend, I'd probably ask some questions and be curious about what the person meant. What did they actually do?
What if the person who was offering the statement, doctor, was very concerned with what the person who was listening to the statement would think of them? Would that, in your experience, influence that kind of conversation?
Which person was worried about which other person? I wasn't
Okay.
following that
So-
hypothetical.
The speaker, the person who was saying, I helped my friend cover up a murder, is talking to another friend explaining what they've done. I want you to assume for a moment that the friend, the person who's saying, the declarant, I covered up a murder for my other friend, I want you to assume that individual is concerned that the listener, the person they talk to, is going to judge them or be upset with them for this kind of conduct. In that scenario, can you see how that might impact the listener from asking additional questions?
It might.
Okay. One moment here. I want to talk about corroboration. Would you agree that the best way to determine whether a memory is real or a product of suggestion is independent corroboration?
Yes.
And that is, again, kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a postulate in what you do, right? I mean, it's like a general tenet of your area of study, right?
It's something I have said in speeches and in writing.
Would you agree that if multiple witnesses have the same general memory, the gist, would you agree that if there is no evidence that the witnesses know each other or have discussed the memory with each other or have been contaminated by the same source of information, that such a scenario would be strong evidence corroborating the memory?
If multiple witnesses are remembering something and there hasn't been contamination, then it might be more indicative of authenticity than if it's just a single witness.
Gosh, guess what word I'm going to ask you about right now? Any idea?
Might.
Might. Yes.
Might.
So you're aware that you said it. Okay. So again, doctor, in the scenario I just gave, wouldn't it be more professionally accurate for you to answer no qualifier that it would, based on your study, tend to corroborate the memory?
Objection, argument.
Rephrase it.
Doctor, would you agree that given your knowledge and your study in this area, that a better, more accurate answer would have eliminated the word might?
I don't agree with that.
Can you please explain why?
Because I've seen situations where multiple people can be wrong. They can be wrong in the same way. Often it happens as a result of external suggestion, but occasionally it happens even when there's no external suggestion.
So I want to give you the following scenario. You know what? I'm going to hold that thought. I'm going to come back to it. I asked you in the hypothetical that I gave you, so I'm going to repeat it for you because I don't think you're understanding it. These individuals,
Move to strike, Your Honor.
it's qualifier.
Move to strike.
No, I don't think commenting on the witness's understanding, that's not necessary. Ask your question again.
Will do.
You do not
Doctor,
need-
I want you to assume that these 6 to 8 people all have a similar memory of the gist of a statement from the same person. Are you following me so far?
Yes?
These individuals, most of whom do not know each other, all of whom have said they've never discussed anything with each other, and all of them have said very confidently that either they had no outside information or they have an extremely strong memory of the actual statement, which was not influenced in any way by any outside statement, outside information. If that hypothetical is accurate, would you agree, doctor, that that would absolutely corroborate each individual's independent memory?
If that had happened, and there were no suggestion, and you had multiple people versus a single person, you could, I suppose, call it corroboration. It would produce a tendency towards wanting to think the gist is accurate.
Well, you said you could call it corroboration. How would that not just be called corroboration?
It's in my field, it's not called corroboration.
Well, corroboration is a word that you've used in your studies and in your books, correct?
Yes?
So why don't you explain to me how that would not be corroboration in your field, please?
Corroboration is truly something independent, that like a photograph or a video that might confirm what somebody is remembering.
So, doctor, I just gave you a hypothetical. You've been told, and you understand as an expert, that when you're given a hypothetical, you are supposed to assume that the facts are true and then give an opinion based on those facts. In the hypothetical I just gave you, I was very clear that there was no contamination. Yet, in the answer you gave, you basically changed my hypothetical and now said, well, unless there was contamination. So here's my question. Did you not understand in the hypothetical I gave you that there was no evidence of contamination? Did you understand that?
I believe I did, but your questions are so convoluted, it's a little hard to keep track of them.
With your PhDs, number 59 on the list, et cetera, you can't track my questions.
Number 58.
I'm glad that you are very good on correcting me with that crucial distinction.
Your Honor, never mind, everybody's.
Yeah, again. You give the impression of quarreling with the witness when you make statements that are not questions. Your role is to ask questions of the witness, not to comment upon each answer. You'll have an opportunity to do that at the time of your argument.
Understood. Doctor, I want you to assume the following, and this is going to be very important. I want you to listen to my questions very carefully. Only answer what I'm asking you. I am not going to talk about witnesses by name. I'm going to talk about ideas. Do you understand that?
Yes?
Okay. I also, in response, I don't think you can do this, I don't want you to indicate any witness by name because I know you've reviewed numerous statements, et cetera. Do you understand what I'm saying so far?
Yes,
Okay. So, did you review statements of witnesses in this case?
I did.
How many? How many witnesses' statements did you review?
I haven't counted them, but many, many witnesses.
If I said 41, does that sound about right?
It could be, I just haven't counted them.
When you reviewed their statements, did you review all statements that they had given?
I don't recall.
Well, I would assume, Doctor, that if you're going to review any statement of any one witness, you're going to want to make sure that you're reviewing all the statements that are available for that witness to give a competent opinion. Am I correct?
Your Honor, I have a legal issue to discuss with you with respect to that question.
Okay, you don't want to discuss it out here, do you? Chambers?
I'd be happy to discuss.
No,
that.
no, we're gonna go in, no, I mean, the way you asked.
Oh, I don't care.
Of course you don't. Now, let's go in chambers, so folks, you can stretch.
May I continue, Your Honor?
Next question.
Doctor, can you tell me what materials did you review in this case?
I reviewed witness statements, I reviewed court testimony, I reviewed media coverage, I reviewed a movie, I reviewed a docudrama. Those are just some of the things I remember reviewing in this case.
But Doctor, the evidence is that you've spent between 73 and 76 hours in total, correct, on this case?
Yes?
Well, as an example, weren't there witnesses that you reviewed that had hours-long interviews and days-long testimony?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This is.
What's the objection, Your Honor?
Irrelevant, Your Honor.
Just a moment.
Different issue, Your Honor.
It is different. Overruled. I'll allow limited inquiry on this point.
Doctor,
Thank you, Your Honor.
I'm just trying to understand, some of the witnesses that you listed had prior interviews and days in court that were days at a time. So I'm trying to understand, if you reviewed everything that you've discussed, how did you do that between 73 and 76 hours?
Sometimes I was reviewing transcripts, not actual live video, and it's quite a bit faster to review a transcript of an interview or a transcript of trial testimony than to actually sit there and watch the testimony as
Doctor,
the jury would.
how many times have you been in a situation where there was a transcript of an interview with the defendant from a police officer, and you having said or made the point that, hey, wait a minute, if I don't actually see what the person said, what the tone of voice was, what the intonations was, that is not helpful?
This is irrelevant.
Sustained.
Thank you.
Are you telling me, Doctor, that you can get the same information out of reviewing a transcript as you can by listening to a recorded statement of a witness?
No, but you can get lots of information from the transcript.
Well, Doctor, in terms of doing your job, instead of getting lots of information, don't you want to get all of the information?
I try to get as much information as I feel I need to offer an opinion.
So you're so qualified at your job that you can give an opinion off a transcript without actually looking at the raw video or audio?
Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant.
Well,
Immaterial, not confined, improper cross.
I think it's argumentative.
Thank you.
I'll sustain that.
So that's on the court's own motion, Your Honor?
Yes.
After the conference.
Doctor, I want to go to another area. Unless Mr. Shestov wants me to keep going in this one. No, okay, I'll go to the next area. You were given hypotheticals by the defense on Tuesday, do you recall?
I was given hypotheticals, yes.
Okay, I
I
want you to
don't
listen.
remember if it was Tuesday or Wednesday, but
I want you to listen to my question very carefully. Would you agree that if the facts that Mr. Chesnoff gave to you in those hypotheticals were incorrect, that that would have a direct bearing that the jury and not you, I'm sorry, that would have a direct bearing on the value of your conclusions?
Objection, form of the question, incorrect.
No, I gave it a
Overruled.
hypothetical.
No,
Overruled.
Your Honor.
If they're incorrect.
Incorrect in what?
What,
I'm sorry.
What are they based on?
Overruled. Thank you. Overruled.
do you understand my question? Do you need me to repeat it?
The jury determines whether a factual basis is present or not. Thus, facts that are supplied are conditional upon the jury finding them to be so. Okay?
Now I understand.
Thank you.
Do you want me to repeat my question, Doctor, or do you?
no, I believe a response to a hypothetical is a response to a hypothetical. The science can apply to a hypothetical, even if it's a completely fabricated, made-up story.
Okay, listen to my question, Doctor. I'm asking you, if the facts in Mr. Chesnoff's hypothetical are not supported by the evidence, would you agree that your conclusions would at the very least have less value?
It's my opinion that the jury can make that decision, but my response is to the hypothetical and how the science might connect to that hypothetical situation.
Objection, non-responsive, motion to strike. Not answer the question.
Stricken.
Doctor, I'm going to ask the question again. This will be the third time. Please answer the question I'm asking you. Well, Your Honor, then will the court...
I will instruct the witness if the
Thank you.
witness needs instruction. You may ask questions. You may ask the next question.
Doctor, would you agree that if, in fact, the facts in the hypothetical that Mr. Chesnoff offered, if those facts are incorrect, would you agree that your conclusions would have, at the very least, less value than if those facts were accurate?
Perhaps, yes.
Okay, please, you say perhaps, which is qualifier, so please explain, Doctor, how it would not simply be a simple yes. Why perhaps?
Because one can respond to a hypothetical situation to make a point about how science works.
So what you're telling me is that in essence, it doesn't matter what hypothetical you're given, because the on button goes on and you just say whatever you want to say.
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Sustained.
One moment. Would you agree, Doctor, that in order to assess whether somebody is the victim of an implanted memory, that it is best to read, listen, and watch every statement of that witness regarding the implanted memory as possible?
I think the more information you look at, probably the better.
So would that be a yes?
Probably yes.
Okay. Are you aware that you used another qualifier or no?
That's what scientists do.
Really? Scientists
Objection,
always
Your Honor.
use qualifiers.
Really? I mean,
Okay, I'll sustain the really as a comment on the witness's answer. You may follow up. You may, I suppose, express incredulity in a different way, but
Yeah.
not directly in that
Well,
fashion.
Doctor, is it truly your testimony that scientists always have to give qualifiers for any opinion they give?
Not always.
Would you agree, doctor, that just about every question I've asked you that has been potentially damaging to the defense, you've managed to put in a qualifier?
I don't know if that's true or not, but I am trying to be careful in my answers.
Did you have the same level of qualifiers when Mr. Chesnoff was examining you?
I'd have to look at the transcript.
Well, doctor, if, again, it only happened 2 days ago, and I'm asking, to the best of your memory, the same memory that was able to distinguish 59 versus 58, based on your memory, do you think that you responded the same way with qualifiers to Mr. Chesnoff's questions as you've done to mine?
I believe that well, my recollection is I did use some qualifiers in responding to him. For example, talking about how post-event information can contaminate somebody's memory. I didn't say it always does.
Well, doctor, in that situation, you would agree that you have to use the qualifier because unlike many of the questions I've asked you, a qualifier simply without being inserted would make your statement untrue.
Argumentative, Your Honor. Also, it's okay, Your Honor.
Rule.
Thank you.
Agree, doctor?
You asked me whether I used qualifiers in my response to Mr. Chesnoff's question, and it's my recollection that I did.
Do you think you used the same or a similar amount of qualifiers with Mr. Chesnoff as you're doing with me?
I don't recall the exact answers.
So, doctor, if somebody put a gun to your head and said, hey, listen, you got to get this answer right, do you think you've used more qualifiers with Mr. Chesnoff or with me? What would you say?
Objection, Your Honor.
It's an argument.
I'm trying to get an answer, Your Honor.
Well, no, a gun to the head is a particularly ugly metaphor, and I'm not going to allow you to insult the witness in this way.
Doctor, if you were put in a position where you had to right now use your best estimate, your best guess as to whether or not you had used more qualifiers with me than with Mr. Chesnoff, what will your answer be?
I would say probably with you because I am...
Motion to strike the rest as non-responsive. It's a yes or no question.
Your Honor, can we have some respect for this
What?
doctor,
Okay,
please?
please be seated. Let me look at the objection. All right, Mr. Chesnoff, same, got this.
Shall I finish my answer?
No,
I asked a
no,
yes or no question.
I'm reviewing the question for the, I have a transcript in front of me, so I'm reviewing the question for the, to assess the objection. Just a moment. Your motion to strike is denied. Next question.
Your Honor, I need to ask the court a question. Mr. Chesnoff's request we go sidebar twice. I need to ask the court a question.
Yes. You may proceed, Mr. Lewin.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, I want you to assume the following, and I want to be clear. This is going to be a hypothetical. I'm going to give you certain facts. In the hypothetical, I don't want you to question whether the facts are true. I want you to accept each fact that I tell you as being true and give an opinion based on that hypothetical. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay, I want you to assume the following. There are 8 people who have a memory of the same close friend who was subsequently murdered, telling them that she had helped another close friend cover up the disappearance of that friend's wife, and or that the close friend had told the speaker that he had murdered the wife. Do you understand so far?
Yes,
I want you to further assume that many of these 8 people do not know each other. Still understand?
yes,
I want you to further assume that each of these 8 people have testified under oath that they have never discussed the information from the murdered friend with any of the other 8. Do you understand that so far?
yes,
I want you to further assume that the versions that the 8 friends testify to are all somewhat different. So in other words, we have the gist is the same, but we have different peripheral details. Do you understand so far?
yes,
I want you to further assume that one of these 8 individuals related the memory to a non-law enforcement person before any of the information that she disclosed was ever available to law enforcement or in the media, etc. Do you understand?
yes,
Would such a scenario, with each of those hypothetical facts being true, would such a scenario be consistent or inconsistent with the implantation of false memory to those 8 people?
in that hypothetical, I would say it's, there's no evidence of any implantation.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate there was no qualifier, and I assume there's no qualifier in that statement because
Please direct Mr. Lewin not to comment on the testimony.
Was-
Yeah, I know I did already. So this is a question, Mr.
Yeah, it's a
Lewin?
question.
Okay,
Got confused.
so this is a prefatory remark to
It
your
is.
question.
I
Go,
would assume,
repeat it.
Doctor, that the reason that you did not give a qualifier in your response is that, given those facts, no qualifier you believe was in any way necessary, correct?
I stated my answer as succinctly to your question as I could.
Right, so again, if you listen to this question, though, you agree you did not give a qualifier, correct?
You'll have to read back my answer. I don't think I used a qualifier.
Okay, so I want you to assume for a moment that you did not use a qualifier, okay? You indicated you're very careful in your testimony, correct? Is that right? You're very careful with what you say.
Yes,
You don't, in other words, you've already testified that when I give a qualifier, I'm not doing it accidentally. I'm doing it on purpose because I want to be right, correct?
right.
And so the fact that you chose not to use a qualifier, you would agree you did not use a qualifier because your opinion of the hypothetical that I gave you, the conclusion that you came,
We apologize.
Before, you're not interrupting the question?
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Your Honor, this is a key question that I do not want.
All right, let's step aside for a second.
Well, I would just like.
1 minute, 1 minute, and then we'll come back, and then we'll take our break. It's quite a ring. All right. We're going to take our break now. So don't converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. Come back at 10:45.